Oh, do you want Gerald or Jerome?
All right, hey, what's going on, everybody? This is Jarrell Mason. Welcome to an episode of Beyond the Album Cover, where we get inside the entertainment industry with those in the know and give them their flowers while they're here to be celebrated. With me, I have a Grammy winner, won a Grammy in 1996 for Best Album Notes for his 47,000 word monograph on the Complete Stacks Bolt Singles Volume 3, 1972-1975, which he was a co producer on, has other Grammy nominations under his belt, had a five-part radio series on the history of Canadian pop, frequent guest spots on the CBC radio show, Definitely Not the Opera, and is currently a professor in the music department at York University in Toronto, Ontario, Canada. Author of the book Soulsville, USA, History of Stax Records, which you can find the Soulsville, USA documentary on HBO and stream it on Max. Ladies and gentlemen, let's give a big thank you to Mr. Rob Bowman for coming on Beyond the Album Cover. Thank you.
Thank you, Jerrell. I'm happy to be here, and I'm
Man,
glad you do what you do.
yes, sir. I appreciate you taking the time to come on board. So let's go ahead and jump right into it. Where were you born, and what was your first musical memory, whether it be on the radio or going to a concert?
Sure. I was born in 1956, June, and 1963. I'm 7 years old. My brother's 7 years older than me. His girlfriend had just come to Toronto from England. She had Beatles records before they hit here. As I'm sure you know, the Ed Sullivan performance was February 64, and in January 64, they started getting massive American radio play. But in the summer of 63, North America didn't know about them. She played those records, and I heard John Lennon singing Twist and Shout, which of course was a cover of an Isley Brothers record, a great R&B tune by a great R&B band. And the rawness and intensity of John's voice changed my life. And at the time, I didn't realize it. But of course, as I got further and further and further into music, I realized, where did that sound come from? It came from the Black Church. That's hard gospel singing morphed through R&B into rock and roll. And if you know the Isley Brothers, who did the original Twist and Shout, they came out of the church and they were definitely hard gospel singers originally.
Yeah, definitely that. And the Beatles definitely set the movement for what was to later come in the rock scene. And for those that don't know, they had originally wanted to sign with Chess Records out of Chicago, but I guess Chess heard the records and passed. And then we later know what became of the Beatles after that.
Absolutely. And the Rolling Stones did eventually record at Chess, but basically, so the Beatles changed everything. Suddenly, life was so much brighter. It wasn't as bad before, but suddenly there was a reason every morning to get up because there were Beatle records. But by the time I'm 8, it's the Stones, 9, Dylan, and then when I'm 10, I buy my first black record. It's Otis Redding's Try a Little Tenderness. And what turned me on to Otis, where the Stones had covered That's How Strong My Love Is, which Otis had recorded. And in an interview, Mick Jagger's going on about how incredible this Otis Redding is. I'm only 10, but I want to find out what he's talking about. So I go to my local record store. I actually want to buy That's How Strong My Love Is, because that's the song the Stones had covered. They don't have it, but they got his latest single, Try a Little Tenderness. Brought it home, put the needle on. And like what happened to me a few years earlier with the Beatles, I just couldn't believe what I heard. It opened up new sonic possibilities, new ideas of what life could be. It had a level of emotional expression that fired my neurons in ways that they had never been fired. It didn't make me say, oh, the Stones aren't nearly as good. They're just super different. I love both, still love both. And, you know, I'm quickly buying other records, Sam and Dave, Rufus Thomas, who, of course, the Stones had covered his Walking the Dog. And I began to make a connection that all of these records were coming out of Memphis and were connected to this one label. Same time, the Stones turned me on to Muddy Waters and Howlin' I went to see Muddy Waters when I was 12 because of how the Stones had introduced me to this music. And on my Christmas tree every year, well, a lot of people have angels on a tree. I have a God I have a star with muddy waters in it.
Wow.
He's an icon, obviously. I saw Wolf. My first interviews were when I was 15. T-Bone Walker, the great blues man who wrote Stormy Monday back in 1949. Second interview was John Lee Hooker. This was when John Lee was not yet big and famous again. This was when he was playing small clubs 6 days a week. But I idolized these people and the music they made. And so that's sort of a quick run through of where I was born, how I got into music, and how, one thing leads to another. And all of that music is still part of my life.
Wow.
All of it.
Wow. Now, I want to know this. When you went to the local record store to buy those stats records, were they the US imports or were they released on another label in Canada? Because I know some of the US labels would do that for international releases.
They were released on another label called Quality in Canada. Um, and but once I got hipper, I mean, I was going to just a mainstream record store. But once I got to know a little more, we got to remember I'm 10, but pretty quickly by 12, I'm seeing money. But I also find out this city has a store that's specialized in imported R&B records. So then I start going, even though it's quite a distance from where I was, but of course, there's so much more on offer, so much more I could hear from the full gamut of Black music. And I was I was hungry for these sounds, for everything I could hear. And again, I'm still buying white rock records. It's not like, some people talk about, they convert, if you will, to something. They don't listen to anything else ever again. For me, I just kept expanding in every direction and eventually buying soul records and blues records and R&B records got me going further back to Black gospel. I have an amazing Black gospel collection. It's pretty definitive historically because that music is the root, both, uh, soul, rock, R&B, the church. Then the Pentecostals, especially starting at the turn of the century back in 1905, 1906, they create this level of intensity in worship manifested in intensity in music that fires so much of the great music, secular music we hear to this day.
Yeah, and it's a pleasure to have you on, given that it's a Black Music Month here in the States and how all those genres, rock, pop, country, dance, house, we could go down the line, all stems back to Black culture and R&B and how rock is pretty much just the blues gone amplified, pretty much.
But
Now,
that's the way it starts.
mhm.
If the history of rock and roll, people who don't know better talk about 1955 and Chuck Berry and Little Richard and Alval having their first hits. But you could find rock and roll just a new form of Black R&B in the late 40s. People like Wynonie Harris are making rock and roll records. And certainly by 51 with Jackie Brenston as Delta Cats, who recorded Sun in Memphis, Rocket 88 is clearly a rock record by any standards. And it's an all black band. I turn on piano and they're playing in some what would have been called jump blues a few years earlier, but the lyrics are more geared towards younger people. The tempo's upped a little bit. And that's really the slight changes that converted the immediate post-war era of R&B to what got called rock and roll. Rock and roll is originally Black music, totally Black music.
Mhm.
And in fact, the name was used by Alan Freed, a white DJ in 51, who was playing Black records, but for a white audience, and felt he needed to not call it R&B, a rhythm and blues, because white parents might somehow not want their kids to listen to it because of racist inclinations that unfortunately permeate and have permeated so much of American society. So he gives it this new term, but he didn't invent the term. I can show you the term rock and roll and Black records going back to the early 1920s. In fact, I think there's one from the 19 teens. And rock and roll meant to dance, to party. And of course, you dance, you party, could become a metaphor for sex as well, but it's used in a general sense for having a great time. Um, so it's a black term, and it was black music. People like Elvis, he's 13 when he moves to Memphis. 1948. 48 was the year WDIA in Memphis became the first station in America to have black disc jockeys playing black records for a black audience the whole time they're on the air. It's the first black appeal station. Some white kids, Elvis being one of them, turned the radio left on the dial. And despite a segregated, very racist world, he could hear black music as much as he wanted all day long. Now, he also listened to pop and country. Elvis wasn't, he was a polyglot. But, and Elvis is the one who became famous. But there's lots of kids who did this. And so in the mid 50s, they start making, because they've come of age, they're 18, 19, and they're making music that draws heavily on black R&B, and the version of black R&B that was called rock and roll. Now, they changed it though, because of course they got all these country influences too. The rockabilly that Elvis starts with is massively black influenced, but it's also got all these country and pop stuff. It's a new hybrid. Doesn't make it better, doesn't make it worse, but he certainly isn't the beginning of rock and roll. He is the beginning of rockabilly, but not rock and roll. And funnily enough, Chuck Berry's coming from the other side. Chuck Berry's black, of course, one of the greatest songwriters in rock history. Chuck Berry came from a middle-class home. His dad was a carpenter who worked for generally pretty wealthy families, and Chuck would go along with him. And when he went into white homes, there I'm sure in black homes too, but he went through their record collections. It's a way of, he was curious. What are these people listening to? And he noticed that the black records that he found most often in white homes at that time were Louis Jordan, the great jump blues artist, one of my favorite artists ever, Louis Jordan, and the Ink Spots. And he began to think, okay, what do these have in common? Why are some white folks at that time, despite segregation and racism, interested in these artists? And he realized one of the things about both of them is they were text heavy. Lots and lots and lots of words that told narrative stories. Chuck was brilliant. He came up as a kid playing blues and R&B, but he realized even in high school, when he entered talent contests at his black high school, if he played a country song, he was different than all the other guys getting there playing blues and R&B derived stuff. So Chuck created a unique hybrid of black-white music, just as Elvis had done, but they came from different sides, in a way past each other like ships in the night, because they made different sounding music that both got called rock music, rock and roll, but the actual elements are different. Chuck's very first single is a country song. Ida Red by Bob Wills and the Texas Playboys. Chuck wrote new lyrics for it and called it Maybelline. Brilliant song. And then he started, the flip side was Wee Hours, which is a straight 12-bar blues, could have been written by Muddy Waters, who, by the way, was Chuck Berry's idol. So the history of American music, and certainly the history of rock and roll, is about cross-pollination. I've always said from the time the first slave master and the first slave heard each other make music, as much as they might have hated each other, their ears were changed. You can't close your ears. You can close your eyes. You can close your mind, but your ears are open. When you hear stuff, it's bound to have an impact on the music you make. And American music has always been this fascinating hybrid. I've given lectures to both all white and all black audiences, and I always talk about anybody who doesn't understand American music as being this hybrid of white and black influences is either racist or historically uninformed. And when I say that to an all white audience, somebody invariably used to say, oh, what about bluegrass? The bluegrass is so black informed. All rhythmic constructs of bluegrass come from Black culture, Black players, and a lot of the white originators talk about that.
Right.
So if you do your work, you know that. And if I talk to an all Black audience, people would sometimes say spirituals. And spirituals are Black culture, just as bluegrass is white culture, because that makes music. Spirituals are absolutely historically and importantly Black culture. But the basic structure, 8 bars and 16 structures, the harmonic changes come from Western Europe. You don't see those in sub-Saharan Africa.
Mm-hmm.
It's
Yeah.
amazing. It's a very ugly historic act, which is slavery, but it's amazing. It's the only place in the world where such large numbers of two different cultures who are brought together unwillingly, at least on one side of it, and all these hybrid musics come out of it, whether we're talking ragtime, hip hop, bluegrass, they're all interrelated. And I think ultimately, there's no American music that I can think of that doesn't have Black influence.
Right.
And I find it interesting that if you go around the world, American music has somewhat dominated because of American economic imperialism, but it's predominantly Black American music, even if made by white artists. They're copying Black hip hop styles, Black dance styles in terms of music making. Um, techno comes out of Detroit, right?
Mm-hmm.
Three Black teenagers in Bellevue, a suburb of Detroit, Juan Atkins, Derek May, and Kevin Saunderson. And of course, look what happens in Europe. The techno thing becomes massive. You get raves and all this stuff. And a lot of people think somehow it's a white version of um, DJ music making. It's not. It comes out of Black culture,
Right. And I
ultimately,
agree.
but it's Black culture influenced by Kraftwerk, a white German. So it's all a mix,
Yeah, it's all a
and it's
mix.
a fascinating.
Yeah, fascinating mixture of different styles, like one big musical gumbo. And it's funny how we talk about a lot of the country influences, how now with Beyonce releasing Cowboy Carter, how a lot of Black folks who felt country wasn't the space for them are starting to get reintroduced to country and saying, hey, we were a part of this movement and we're now going to reclaim the space. Because if you go back and look at D. Ford Bailey and a lot of the other Black acts that appeared at the Grand Ole Opry and the current acts like Jimmy Allen, Mickey Guyton, the War and Treaty, Kane Brown, and we can go down the list, and how because of Beyonce and her status as today's pop icon, she's bringing her crowd into a space where it once felt wasn't for them, but now it's starting to learn that no, we influenced this here too, influenced this here as well.
100%. And don't forget Little Nas X.
Oh yeah, for
Uh,
sure, Lil Nas
he,
X.
you know, obviously he was hitting country buttons a few years ago. And historically, there's lots of people. Obie McClinton, Linda Martell, Stoney Edwards, all Black artists making very fine country music. Unfortunately, because of the racism in the music industry, none of them achieved substantial success. Charlie Pride is the only one who did historically. And then there's people like you mentioned, D. Ford Bailey, who I adore. Not only did he play harmonica on the Grand Ole Opry, he made several records, and they were great records.
Mm.
He's a hero of American music. He was a Black guy in the 20s and 30s at the center of country music.
Right. Now, I want to talk about the history of these two former Canadian AM stations that were the equivalent to the US Top 40, CKLW out of Windsor and Chum 1050 AM out of Toronto, which is now currently a TSN affiliate. So, can you talk about the impact of those two AM stations and how they kind of was for Canada what those US Top 40 AM stations were back in the day when AM was in its prime?
You've done your homework. I'm impressed. CKLW was in Windsor, right across from Detroit. And the program director was a woman, Rosie Lee Tremblay. So that's significant in and of itself. At that time, women didn't get those kind of positions. Rosie Lee was key in terms of breaking records, not just in Canada, but in the US. When I first met Al Bell, who ended up owning Stax Records, an incredibly interesting and smart Black businessman, he told me about how key CKLW, even though it's a Canadian station, wasn't breaking records in Detroit. And Rosie Lee had wide open ears. She played black and white music, by the way. It wasn't just R&B. It wasn't just pop and rock. She actually mixed the two and had a lot to do with the success of people like Funkadelic and Bob Seger. So she was really important. And of course, anybody in the Windsor area adored CKLW and Rosalie Tremblay and the other DJs in that station. Growing up in Toronto, which is where I grew up, Chum AM, this is before FM radio exists, Chum AM was the pop station, if you will. And in Toronto at that time, we did not have a black station, although lots of Torontonians would listen to WBLK out of Buffalo, because that was a black station for the Buffalo market. Well, we could get it here. So if you're inclined to really want to know about what was happening in black music, WBLK out of Buffalo is where you went. Chum would play things like, Wilson Pickett, Otis Redding, Millie Small out of Jamaica, Desmond Decker out of Jamaica for that matter, Ronettes. I mean, they played lots of black music, and James Brown, of course, but they were still primarily geared towards a white pop and rock audience. So you'd get a lot more stuff out of WBLK you would never get here. So it was all available. And at nighttime, you probably know about this. You seem very, very knowledgeable. But WLAC out of Nashville, it had a 50,000 watt broadcast range. And in the evening, where you get those skips in the airwaves, you could hear it up here. It blanketed half of America and the lower part of Canada. And WLAC, three other DJs, Gene Nobles, John Richburg, known as John R., and Hoss Allen, played nothing but black music. So it was amazing. Radio was incredible quite right then in terms of, because there were less vehicles, there wasn't FM, there wasn't, of course, online, it wasn't so niche, no Sirius XM or any of that stuff. You only had a few outlets. So through those few outlets, you could hear virtually everything, as opposed to now where everything's so narrowcast. You want to hear metal, you can just listen to one Sirius XM station. You want to hear hip hop, you can listen to another XM station. You want to hear jazz, you go to another. Back then, things got mixed a lot because there were so few delivery channels.
Yeah, so it was almost kind of like the formatting was kind of like over in the UK with Capital Radio with BBC One, where they would just play a freeform format of different genres, whereas here in the States, it's pretty much segregated based off of genre. And like we explained earlier, we know why that they segregated the genres. It's a dirty little word called racism. Look it up, Google it, people. And how, once the artists from England and other countries came over to the States, they had to understand that you had to play the race game.
Unfortunately, all of that is so true. But one thing I will give artists like Stones out of the UK is they turn on a lot of people who otherwise wouldn't know about post-war urban blues, about soul music, because they covered a lot of it. And they always credited people and always talked about their heroes, which were largely black, in interviews. And I'm an example. They turned me on to all of that. And of course, I went deeper and further, but that was the introduction point, because I wouldn't get that in any detail. I never would have heard Muddy Waters on pop radio ever.
Right.
But the Stones turned me on to it. And then we got FM radio happening, freeform FM radio initially. Now it's all programmed. But it was initially freeform, and those DJs could play what they wanted. They'd play, the new Stones record or Cream record, and then they'd play Four Cuts by Muddy Waters. They'd sometimes play Albert King and then play a cover of Albert King by, a rock artist. They played a massive range of stuff, and they had free reign. And that was even so much more educational than even AM was.
Yeah.
It was incredible what you got to hear.
Yeah, and then back over to the UK really quick, how you had to literally go underground and listen to pirate radio stations in order to get R&B, reggae stuff that you wouldn't hear on BBC One, Capital Radio. You only also heard on pirate radio stations, probably like Radio Caroline, Radio Luxembourg, and then it wasn't until 1990 when Kiss FM applied for a license to be on the air legally after years of being an underground station that the UK got their first real live legal station where you play R&B black music over in the UK all the time. And that movement, that Brit Soul movement, I feel doesn't get enough credit when we talk about the history in music such as Sade, Loose Ends, Soul to Soul, 52nd Street, and also Five Star came out of that movement. And they were, of course, the UK equivalent to the Jackson 5.
100%. Those pirate radio stations before Kiss FM got their license were so important. Radio Luxembourg, by the way, wasn't a pirate station.
Oh,
It
excuse
was
me.
in the country of Luxembourg. It was a very small thing, but you could hear it in England. But the pirate stations, as you know, they simply would go outside British water territory on a boat and broadcast. And of course, easily you'd have enough power to go across England, and the English government couldn't control it. The English government for a long time kept radio and TV down to BBC One, BBC Two, and a few other things. And you can hear black music on those stations, but very limited. 2 hours a week, maybe
Mm,
Saturday morning. Alexis Corner would have his blues and soul show.
mm,
But the rest of the week, you're hearing classical, you're hearing vaudeville, British pop, but you weren't hearing the stuff that the pirate stations started playing. And if you watch the Stax documentary, um, Emperor Roscoe was interviewed. He was a DJ on Radio Caroline, and he was playing Stax stuff on that boat and turning British kids onto stuff they might not have heard otherwise. Very, very, very important in terms of spreading the magic of this music and opening up work opportunities as well for Black American artists.
mm. And I was curious, did Canada have its equivalent to US American Bandstand or UK's BBC's Top of the Pops?
We had teen pop rock dance shows like American Bandstand and like Top of the Pops. Absolutely. Canada at the time was much more white than the US. Our Black population was important, but much smaller. That changed in 1967. Our Prime Minister at that time, Pierre Trudeau, who was the father of the current Prime Minister, opened up our immigration laws tremendously. And we got a massive, massive influx of African Caribbean people out of Jamaica and Trinidad, Antigua, and so on. This city became an incredible reggae city because of that influx. But the kids of those immigrants grew up with hip hop and Jamaican music. And when you listen to early Canadian hip hop, people like Michi Me, you can hear that Jamaican influence massively and the American influence combined. So a lot of Canadian hip hop has often had this other tinge, if you will, that's not so manifest in American hip hop. And Toronto's now the most multicultural city in the world. The UN's dubbed it that, more than New York, more than London, more than Paris. The immigration laws, the way they were opened up, were astonishing. We got people from everywhere. It's great. Makes the city, for me, fantastic. Not all of Canada is as multicultural, but Toronto is insane that way in the best sense of the word. And we get music from everywhere. You want to go hear Ethiopian music? We got it. You want Somalian music? We got that. You want German music? We got that. You want Thai music? We got that. It's all because of the great move that Pierre Trudeau made in terms of opening up our borders. Radio reflected that. In the days I was coming up, you didn't, and the dance shows reflected that. So yes, you had those dance shows, and you'd get some black artists, but fewer than you might get percentage-wise on the American equivalents, if you will. Um, Otis Redding, I remember appearing on one. Jackie Shane, who, by the way, I just did a documentary on her, which hopefully will be coming out at the end of the year. An incredible black soul singer who moved up here and was transgendered. Pickett. You'd get the bigger stars. You wouldn't get people like Ruby Johnson or Mabel John, for example. You'd certainly get the Supreme Temptations. We're so close to Detroit that a lot of the Motown people came up here. And as well, Motown was so pop in terms of its success that, all the radio stations played tons of Motown, more than any other form of black music. So that happened here. But it changed very much as we moved to the late 60s and we start getting this substantive immigration population. And part of it was also American draft dodgers, black and white. So we got a massive influx of Americans coming here to get out of the draft and didn't want to go to Vietnam. In fact, the baseball team I started playing on in my 20s was all draft dodgers except for me. I was the only Canadian. We were playing baseball on a Toronto team.
Right, right. And I believe one of those draft dodgers was a pretty famous Rick James. He was in a band with Crosby, Still, Nash and Young, Neil Young. And then, of course, once Rick got sent back to the States after being told on for going AWOL, we all know what happened later with Rick James and the success that he's had. And, of course, out of Buffalo, New York.
Yeah, absolutely. Rick was performing with Neil Young as part of the Minor Birds. And Rick was the lead singer. Neil played guitar and wrote some songs, but he was not the lead singer. And of course, both Neil and Rick went on to massive careers in separate worlds, but massive careers. George Clinton told me an interesting story last October when I was talking to him. He told me Motown wanted Bootsy, and Bootsy wasn't going to go there. Bootsy was sticking with the P-Funk mob. And according to George, Motown took Rick James instead. Now, I don't know how true that is because the Minor Birds had cut a couple of songs at Motown. Motown nearly signed the group with Neil Young. So the fact they signed Rick James 4 or 5 years later, they already knew about him. But that's what George Clinton says. They wanted Bootsy, wouldn't go, so they decided to take Rick James and make him into what he became.
Yeah, and it ended up working out for both parties. Now we're mentioning Canadian hip hop, and you mentioned the influx of the Afro Caribbeans coming into Canada. The first taste in the US that we had to Canadian hip hop prior to Drake, Cardinal Official, was when Snow hit it with Informer, which was a pop hit here in the States. And of course, he had the patois going and they had the subtitles at the bottom. And of course, that was also written by MC Shan, who came from Marley Marl, Cold Chillin', the Juice Crew. And we mentioned Maestro Fresh West prior to coming on for this interview and how he was really the godfather of Canadian hip hop. You had other acts like Infinite, MCJ, Cool G, but Maestro Fresh West pretty much took the template of what was coming on in the US, applied the Canadian spin with it, with Drop the Needle, Let Your Backbone Slide. And I put him as the Canadian equivalent to Big Daddy Kane. So can we talk about him and his influence on Canadian hip hop?
Oh, Maestro is the godfather of Canadian hip hop. There were people rapping before him, but not that many, and nobody had national, let alone international success. When Maestro blew up with Let Your Backbone Slide, it's sort of like, people say when the Beatles hit hundreds of thousands of guitars. When Maestro blew up in Canada, thousands of kids started rapping. And everything centered around Maestro in Toronto, and Toronto's the economic and cultural center of the whole country. I think I mentioned earlier, Michi Me.
Mm-hmm.
Michi Me, when Boogie Down Productions came up here, Michi Me was lower on the bill. And KRS-One loved what she was doing, brought her to New York. This is after Let Your Backbone Slide, but not much after. It's very early still. And she had a huge influence. Got an American contract, had a big influence on Boogie Down Productions, but also had success in the US. And so she's second after Maestro. And of course, later on, hip hop blows up here. Dream Warriors, do you remember them?
I do not
Dream Warriors.
recall.
Oh, Dream Warriors were the second hip hop artist after Maestro to break that big nationally and in the UK. I don't know how well they hit in the US. The fact you don't recall them means they probably didn't hit as hard as they would have wanted to. They had some of that jazz influence that you hear with Guru and Jazzmatazz.
So
They were
Gangstar, Tribe
absolutely,
Called Quest, that kind of whole vibe, Native Tongues, kind of
yeah.
sort
They
of.
were great. Their big record was Boombastic Thing. It was a wonderful, wonderful record. But over time, hip hop has become just as in the States, we have, at least on a national level, and some of them certainly have broken into the US at some level, huge artists, Cardinal and Official, perhaps being one of the most important.
Then, of course, on the
And
R&B
of course,
side,
I forget Drake.
yeah,
I'm
Drizzy
forgetting
Drake.
Drake when I'm saying that because obviously Drake is blowing up international, close to the size of the biggest stars from anywhere. But it's funny, I forget him because he's not. Drake's more popish for me than some of the harder hitting rap artists that this country's produced. And although he's definitely hip hop, he's also such a huge pop success. I tend to forget about him as being part of the hip hop scene here. So my
Right.
fault there, because Drake is beloved by many in the hip hop world. He has really put Toronto on the map in the hip hop world. I think the dispute these days between him and Kendrick is kind of silly, but what are you going to do about it?
Right. And of course, Drake got his start as Wheelchair Jimmy on a beloved Canadian institution, Degrassi, which originally came from the kids of Degrassi Street and then morphed into Degrassi Junior High, Degrassi Next Generation, and it aired here in the States on PBS. So, can we talk about how important an institution to Canada Degrassi is?
Oh, Degrassi is one of the most popular Canadian shows ever produced. And as you just said, there were a couple of spin-off series from the original, and they were all successful. And anyone growing up here over the 20 or so years that the different versions of Degrassi aired, it's part of their life. It's absolutely a signpost to when they were young and watching it. And Drake, yes, was this kid in a wheelchair on it, this very, a lot of people would say cute kid, middle class kid. You got to remember, Drake grew up privileged. Drake's house, not now, because of course he's got a mansion in the same place Prince once had a house here. But when Drake grew up, he grew up in one of the richest neighborhoods in Toronto. And, he was in a position that would get him into a place like Degrassi in terms of a TV show, a position that lots and lots of young black talent or young white talent for that matter would never have gotten if they hadn't been born in such privilege.
Mm-hmm. And of course, we talked about how
Now, you're
Drake
frozen, Jarrell. I'm not hearing it.
Yeah, so we're talking about how Drake has roots within funk and soul. Of course, Dad Dennis Graham, Uncle Larry Graham from Sly and the Family Stone, Graham Central Station, and Uncle Teeny Hodges, who was the lead rhythm guitarist and songwriter over at High Records, also out of Memphis. Can we talk about the comparing and contrasting between Stax and High, both are out of Memphis, doing the same thing? And do you think they were both keeping eye on each other and keeping score just like Stax was doing with Motown?
They were definitely keeping score, but in a friendly way. I mean, but they absolutely wanted to top each other. It's interesting. Teeny Hodges, who you just mentioned, one of the most brilliant guitarists in American history. I adore Teeny, and Teeny was a good friend until he passed away. And that was a family band, as I'm sure you know, the High Rhythm section. Three of them were Hodges. And then, of course, there was Archie Turner on keys and Howard Grimes on drum. Incredible house band. Analogous band, if you will, to Booker T and the MGs over at Stax. House band, all the records, whether it's Syl Johnson, Ann Peebles, Al Green, Quiet Elegance, they all have a similar sound because it's the same players. One of the really interesting things, though, when I say they have the same sound, I mean all the high records had the same sound, all the Stax records for a long period had the same sound, but they had a different sound from each other, even though just a few blocks away around the corner. And it's interesting that Al Jackson, who was a great drummer with Booker T and the MGs, and so much a determinant of the Stax sound, also played a lot at high instead of Howard Grimes. Sometimes they had two drummers on them. And when Al Jackson played over at high, he played incredibly differently. At Stax, he had this whomping snare sound, a delayed backbeat, and didn't use cymbals, ride cymbals and stuff, and riding on a hi-hat. Whereas at high, he played a lot of tom-toms. Well, big part of the high sound was that tom-tom thing, and he played more cymbals. Same time, the Memphis Horns, who were largely Wayne Jackson on trumpet, White, Andrew Love on tenor sax, Black. Those two were the core of the Memphis Horns. A third and fourth member varied a lot over the years. They played at both studios, and the Memphis Horns played differently at Stax and differently at high. At high, they had a sense of what Willie Mitchell, the producer, wanted. Willie Mitchell's a great artist as well as producer, and they played for that. The horns are much more laid back, much more behind the beat at high. Stax, they're fiery. They were inspired at Stax by Otis Redding, who would run up the studio floor and shake his fists in their face, shouting out horn riffs to them. I mean, it was electric in those sessions. Otis would have everybody, as Wayne Jackson told me, frothing at the mouth. It was like he was performing instead of being in the studio. High, different kind of vibe. Al Green's a more mellow kind of music. Al Green's one of the greatest soul singers ever, and so is Otis Redding, but they're very different kinds of singers. And so these horn players and the drummer Al Jackson played incredibly differently. It's amazing when you think about it.
Right.
Distinctive sounds, great, stunning records. Same city.
Right. And the crazy thing with Motown.
You're freezing up in me. I can't hear you.
So the crazy thing about Motown is that we think about how they influenced the world and how Berry Gordy's MO from the get-go was pop, middle of the road, we want to cross over. But Stax was pure, unadulterated R&B, and it wasn't until Otis did the Monterey Pop Festival that the unadulterated R&B crossed pop.
Well, and in Europe, it had crossed a little earlier. And of course, there was the Stax Volt Tour, which had Otis, Sam, and Dave, Carla Thomas, Eddie Floyd, Booker T and the MGs that went to Europe for a month in April. Monterey Pop was later in the summer. It was those two moments together, but Europe, it was already, they were stunned. When the Stax Review landed in London, the Beatles had sent limousines to pick them up. They were stunned. They were selling out every show, whether it was Copenhagen, Oslo, or London or Paris. That audience was already into them deeply. America was behind, and Monterey had a huge influence, not just where Otis and the MGs blew people away. They closed Saturday night right after the Jefferson Airplane, and they couldn't have been more different, but they blew people away. He'd already played the Fillmore, which was the Rock Ballroom in San Francisco a year earlier. So some people in that area knew about him. Some of the white people in that area knew about him. Obviously, black people did. And he played for a week at the Whiskey in LA, which was a white rock club. So again, before Monterey, but it's still small numbers. Monterey's a huge festival, and maybe even more important, the movie Monterey Pop, which comes out a year later in '68. Otis has a huge role in that, as does Jimi Hendrix and The Who and Janis Joplin. But that film took Otis even further in terms of crossing pop. And of course, the irony is, Monterey Pop was in June. Otis dies in a tragic plane crash in December. Before he dies, he spent 3 weeks in the studio making enough for 4 albums. And one of those songs is Sitting on the Dock of the Bay, which was released after he died, a massive change in style, influenced big time by both Bob Dylan and Sgt. Pepper's Hearts Club Band, according to the Stax musicians, as well as Otis's manager, Phil Walden. And it takes Otis to #1 on the pop charts, and he's #1 on the R&B charts too. He's huge both places. And who knows what would have happened if he lived, but the dam had broken open, certainly. And, you know, yeah, Otis was my intro, as I mentioned earlier, to black music when I was 10. I was devastated when he died. And so was Stax. He was the heart and soul of the label in that first period.
Right. And it's funny how you say Stax influenced, Muscle Shoals, what was going down with Rick Smith and Fame Studios, and how they were trying to get that Stax influence sound down there. And of course, Rita cut Respect down at Fame, but Otis did it first. It became a hit for Otis, but Aretha added a woman's touch to it, that little seasoning, and it became the worldwide, internationally renowned, respected record that it is today.
Incredible, stunning record. And the other side of that record recorded in Muscle Shoals was I Never Loved a Man the Way That I Loved You. And both of those songs are beyond belief. And in fact, I have to say a couple of things. I'm working on a book on Muscle Shoals right now. And it's Rick Hall who owned Fame Studios.
Mm.
And the reason Aretha went there is because a year earlier, Wilson Pickett, who'd recorded Midnight Hour, 6345789, Don't Fight It, big hits at Stax, even though he's an Atlantic artist. Jerry Wexler co-owned Atlantic, sent him down to Stax to get that sound. Pickett was a difficult individual, and Booker T and the MGs told Jim Stewart, who co-owned Stax, they didn't want to work with him anymore. So Wexler had to find controls, as you rightly said, the house beloved with Booker T and the MGs and trying to get that sound. So Wexler took Pickett there, and the first session they cut Land of a Thousand Dances, later cut Mustang Sally. These are huge records. So when he signs Aretha, who by the way Stax could have had, but with $35,000, and Jim Stewart thought it was too much money. What a mistake. Anyway, so Atlantic signs her, and of course Wexler takes her to Muscle Shoals, and they actually cut I Never Loved a Man the Way I Love You, and it was Do Right Woman was the other side. Respect was cut in New York, because what happened in Muscle Shoals is Aretha's husband, Ted White, who was also her manager, got into it with a session musician who he thought was being too depending who you talk to disrespectful Aretha in terms of what said to her, and it might have been racist, it might have been just hitting on her a little bit or flirting with her. Either way, Ted White was not happy. There's a massive fight later at the hotel after the session, and from then on, Aretha refused to go to Muscle Shoals, but flew the Muscle Shoals rhythm section to New York. And that's where all of her early great soul hits were cut, except for those first two songs. They're all cut in New York, but with the Muscle Shoals rhythm section.
Yeah, and I didn't know this until I saw a documentary on Wham that George Michael went to go to Muscle Shoals to cut a version of Careless Whisper, which after he heard it, was like, nah, I think I could do better. And then he went back to the UK, recorded the version that we know and love today, and it was on Make It Big. And then, of course, George Michael became an international superstar once Faith dropped in '87. It was the first album by a white artist to go #1 on the US R&B charts on Billboard, and he won the American Music Award for Best R&B Album, R&B Artist on the American Music Awards back in '89. Of course, in the States, it was a huge deal. You got this white British kid winning a black award, and he kind of had some blowback from that, and it was because of that he named his next album after Faith, Listen Without Prejudice.
Absolutely true. Funny, a little side note, that Muscle Shoals version became a hit in Japan. So there's actually two versions of that record out, but most people know, of course, the one he recut after that. But the Muscle Shoals version, for some reason, was released in Japan and became a big hit there. It's interesting to blow back to George Michael's #1 R&B record, and psychologically, I understand it. But it's similar to the blowback against Beyonce in the country world for Cowboy Carter. And personally, black, white, green, or blue, if you make great music that fits a genre, it goes to #1, that tells you something that for most people in that genre, at least as industry are measuring things, um, they've done it. They've done a great record. I don't care what color they are. And Beyonce, the first black woman to have a #1 in country. It's great and opened the door for people, further for people like Mickey Guyton, who I think the second #1 shortly after Beyonce. Plus, ended up turning people on to earlier artists like Linda Martell, who was a guest spot on the album. Um, and, I can't speak for George Michael fans or Wham fans, but I am sure that George Michael's music turned a lot of British kids and American white kids onto lots of other Black music. So this stuff goes back and forth. And I personally think that it's great to hear something as great music and not be hung up whether they're Black and recording country or white and recording R&B. There's lots of examples in both those genres of people making great records who don't fit the stereotype of the artists who generally make the music.
Right. And to circle back to Chum really quick, didn't Rick Moranis do his thing as a DJ at Chum prior to breaking into acting and comedy and getting on SCTV with John Candy, Catherine O'Hara, Dave Thomas, Eugene Levy, and all of those guys? John Candy.
Oh, yeah. SCD, of course, started in Toronto. And yes, Moranis had been on the air up here. He was hysterical. And the whole SCTV thing leads to Saturday Night Live. And of course, the producer of Saturday Night Live, is a Canadian as well. I mean, Saturday Night Live was dominated by Canadians. Dan Aykroyd's Canadian. It was amazing how much Toronto became eventually this dominant world in terms of comedy at that time, on TV at least.
Right. And what was your take on Much Music when it debuted in Canada and how it was similar or different than MTV?
Well, Much Music debuted 2 years after MTV. And obviously, with MTV's massive success, Much was following. But there's a couple interesting things. We have radio and television regulations here that are called CanCon regulations, Canadian Content CanCon. And that means anybody licensed to broadcast here needs to have a certain percentage of content made in Canada by Canadians. And so when Much Music started, they needed Canadian videos. Of course, they easily had access to the videos that were playing on MTV already, but they needed Canadian videos. And there weren't that many to begin with. Much would play nearly anything initially that was pop, R&B, rock oriented. And because Canada, and Toronto especially, where Much Music was based, is so multicultural, lots and lots and lots of Black music got played on Much Music. As I'm sure you know, MTV was very resistant to Black music until finally Michael Jackson and Prince had to break that wall because there was such a demand for them. But MTV was definitely, they'll say they were having a oriented towards a target audience. Other people will say they were simply racist. Read it as you want. Much Music was much more open, much more reggae, and calypso for that matter at times. And Canadian hip hop was massively supported on Much Music.
Right. And because of
It
Much
had a big
Music,
influence across the
yeah,
country.
yeah, and because of Much Music and in Canada, that's how the word started to spread about Backstreet Boys because they went over to Europe first, blew up in Europe, and then they came to Canada, released their international version of debut album, and then because of that, that's when it started trickling down the States with Quit Playing Games, and then that's when they recut the US version of their album, and then of course NSYNC and a lot of those pop acts from the 90s, 2000s follow that model where you went international first to cut your teeth, make noise over there, then come back in the States and become an international star.
100%. And part of that is um, a lot of Canadian artists feel historically, I think it's changed now because Canada punches way above its weight in terms of record sales by Canadian artists. I mean, it's stunning. Um, this country's 10% the size of the US, but is much more than 10% of the music market. But for a long time, there was the attitude that American record companies felt that Canadian music was not going to sell in the US. They thought it was artificially propped up by the CanCon laws. So even if it was a hit here, didn't mean it would be in the US. So Canadian artists often had to break big in Europe, especially the UK, for American record companies to suddenly think, and American radio, oh, this is important. And what if they just came from Canada, they weren't going to break. And they had to go to the UK for a lot of people to have notoriety to the point where American radio and American radio stations would pump them up.
Yeah, because I didn't know this about
And,
Alanis.
America used to be like that about international radio.
Mhm. Yeah, because I didn't know this
I
about.
was going to say, America was like that when the Beatles came.
Yeah, yeah, they were like that when the Beatles came in. I didn't
Sorry, you're
know.
broken up. I didn't know.
Yeah, so I didn't know this about Alanis Morissette that she cut two pop records that was in the vein of Paula Abdul. And before she became a pop artist, she was on You Can't Do That on Television, which was a Canadian import that came on Nickelodeon. It was one of the first shows that really launched Nickelodeon as the premier kids network. But it wasn't until she cut Jagged Little Pill that she became an international star. So can you talk about Alanis Morissette and how she went from teen TV star, pop star, rock international superstar with Jagged Little Pill?
Well, in many ways, Alanis, who did have success as a pop star and a TV actress, was mainstream. And she reinvented herself with Jagged Little Pill. She reinvented herself in terms of grooves, what kinds of grooves she'd have on her records, but even or as importantly, the lyrics. Jagged Little Pill was an in-your-face record in terms of lyrics addressing sexuality, relationships. It was not what we think of as a fluffy pop record. Alanis became a serious artist, and she wouldn't have gone anywhere when it was just AM radio. But of course, with FM radio and then later the internet, um, she found a massive audience. Uh, Why Did You Do It? The song about a boyfriend who had sex with somebody else, cheated on her, is so full of rage about this partner. Refers very directly to the sexual act that he was engaged in with this woman. That's a record that, mainstream radio isn't going to play, but you can get mainstream success if you're not going straight pop. Her pop dance records are fine, but they're not special. Jagged Little Pill was a big game changer.
Yeah, it definitely was a big game changer. Got airplay on MTV, and it launched her in the worldwide stratosphere. And then, of course, we had Bare Naked Ladies. 1 week they exploded here in the States, and I believe wasn't Soul Decision from Canada as well.
I don't think so, but don't quote me on that. I'd have to check, but I
Okay.
don't think so.
Okay. So how did you end up getting into the Soulsville, USA documentary on HBO? How long was the process and what was it like telling the history of Stax for a worldwide audience and some probably getting introduced to Stax for the first time via the documentary?
I did my PhD in Memphis, and I did my dissertation on Stax Records. This is back in the 80s. Um, because of my work on Stax at that point, I started writing a lot of liner notes for various Stax reissues, including the one you mentioned earlier that won a Grammy. I had 5 other Grammy nominations. And I spent 12 years working on Stax Records. Wrote the book Soulsville, USA, The Story of Stax Records. It came out in 1997, won 2 of the 3 American Music Book Awards that year, and won awards in Italy and Japan, later inducted in the Blues Hall of Fame in Memphis. That book led to the creation of the Stax Museum of American Soul Music, which I was intimately involved in the content of that museum. Going further, that led to a documentary film and a co-French and British production called The Soul of Stax. That was 94, I believe. And then later there was an American film that wasn't as good as the current thing called Respect Yourself. And then, I've kept doing work on Stax, directly for Stax artists. Um, and the idea of a massive documentary, originally going to be 6 parts, came out as 4 parts, as you know. That started 5 years ago. And although my book had been optioned several times, John Singleton, director, did Boys in the Hood and the remake of Shaft that optioned my book, but didn't get it produced. Several people have done that. But this documentary finally came to be. And again, started 5 years ago, working very heavily on it 4 years ago. And so I'm a co-executive producer. My book is credited as the inspiration and basic source material for the documentary. I'm interviewed extensively in it, as you know if you've seen it, which I think you have. Um, some of my interviews with people who have died, I interviewed well over 100 people associated with Stax, artists, session musicians, engineers, producers, front office people, and all 3 owners at various times. They're used in the film. And I was a creative consultant. I worked very closely with the director, Tamila Wignot, a Black woman who did an amazing job. She'd won an award at Sundance for her last film about Alvin Ailey, great black dance choreographer. Her work is amazing. Jamila wanted to tell the truth, and which is exactly what I've always wanted. The end of Stax, where it was forced out of business, has often been whitewashed. I tell it straight in my book, and Jamila told it straight in the film. And we constantly talked throughout those 4 years about what should be in the film, how it should be constructed, and so on. And I think she did a brilliant job.
Yeah, it was definitely an eye-opening documentary, especially the end of Stax and the true story. Now, one of the people that was interviewed in the Stax documentary, James Alexander from the Barcades, and it's crazy to hear the story of how they ended up getting on Stax and becoming the band for Otis Redding. But I'm sure you may or may not know this, that hip-hop producer Jazzy Faye is James Alexander's son.
Of course, I know that. James has been a friend of mine for 40 years. And, I adore the Barcades, both in their 2 different manifestations at Stax, and then their later manifestation when they're on Mercury and had all those massive funky hits. They were a great band. Their last single on Stax, Holy Ghost, didn't get heard by many people because Stax was going bankrupt. Um, but it is on that third box set that you mentioned earlier that I won a Grammy for. It's one of the hottest records I've ever heard in my life. I think it would have blown up if Stax hadn't been going out of business. But of course, they started with a very different lineup. James was there, and so was Ben Colley, the trumpeter, but all the rest of the members of the band unfortunately died with Otis Redding in that plane crash in December 67. They have been young kids, all went to Booker T. Washington High School. Same high school, by the way, that Booker T had gone to, as well as David Porter and many, many other people who made their way to Stax, the Mad Lads, and so on. Amazing who came out of that school. But the Bar-Kays were kids, and they worshipped the MGs. They'd hang around at Stax. Their drummer, Carl Cunningham, set up a shoe stand outside Stax and would shine people's shoes for money. But when he could, he'd get in the studio and have Al Jackson show him stuff. And they became very, very good players to the point where Stax started seeing them as potentially a second rhythm section to Booker T and the MGs as Stax was getting bigger. Otis decided they were good enough. He wanted them as his road band, and they were the best road band he ever worked with outside of the MGs. And the MGs were too busy in the studio to back Otis up very much. They did Monterey, they did the European tour, and a few local shows, but in general, Otis had a road band that wasn't as good as the MGs or the Bar-Kays. So starting in the spring of 67, the Bar-Kays became his backup band and worked with them that spring and early summer, except for Monterey. Then Otis took a few months off because he had polyps on his throat he needed to be operated on. Came back in November and just started doing gigs again, and plane went down on the way to Madison, Wisconsin, leaving Cleveland. And the show never happened. So he played Nashville Friday night, Cleveland Saturday night, appeared on the Don Webster Upbeat show with the Bar-Kays in Cleveland, TV show, and flying to Madison. Plane had trouble and dropped into Lake Winona. Horrible tragedy.
Yeah, very horrible.
James wasn't on the plane. James wasn't on the plane. He's a lucky man because the plane was one short seat of being able to fit the whole band. So somebody would always fly commercial, or the plane would come back and get him to get to the gig. And it was James' turn to not be on the plane. Ben Colley, great trumpet player, later became a session musician at Stax and Muscle Shoals when he left the Bar-Kays. Ben was asleep, didn't have a seatbelt on, and couldn't swim. But he had his arms around the seat cushion, which of course was a life preserver in the water. He was so lucky. When that plane crashed, he was shot out of it, holding that cushion, which he hung on to as a life preserver, and he lived to be pulled out of the water. As he's floating in the water, he's hearing his friends in the band, one by one, calling out for help, and then the call stopped as they drowned. Ben told me that in detail. What unbelievable moment. A, his luck, the way he survived, but B, the horrible, horrible experience of hearing all these friends and Otis drown one by one.
Yeah, I can only imagine, seeing something traumatic as that. That's something that you'll never get over or forget. And you mentioned Otis Redding. I believe his sons had went into the music business. They cut a record as the Reddings. They had a record called Remote Control. And for some that do and don't know, the melody of that chorus was used in My Prerogative by Bobby Brown, which became an international smash.
Absolutely. And in fact, the Reddings, as they were called, recorded, I think, 3 albums. That was their biggest hit, but they kept going. And unfortunately, as happens with a lot of artists, they have some success and things don't always continue that way. So they eventually, gave it up. But they're still very involved. Their sister, Carla Andrews Redding, is really the person who deals with most of the business for Otis's widow, Zelma, who's still alive, but trusts Carla with everything. But Carla consults, obviously, with her mother and her brothers who were in the Reddings. It's a very tight family. I've been to the Big O Ranch, which is where they most of them live in separate houses on the ranch. Beautiful gates with O in the middle, which Otis had made when he was alive. He adored that ranch. It's a pretty special place. He's buried right beside the main house.
Yeah, and how we talked about with Stax, how it was the forerunner for what was to later come out of Memphis with the hip hop scene with DJ Spanish Fly, 3 6 Mafia, 8 Ball, MJG, Young Dolph, rest in peace, and currently Glorilla. So can we just talk about the importance of Stacks in hip hop, not just for the Memphis hip hop scene, but hip hop in general? Because a lot of those Stacks records were reintroduced to generations like myself and younger thanks to those hip hop samples.
100%. When my book came out, I didn't know Chuck D of Public Enemy. We met later, but he told me he bought close to 100 copies of it and gave them to everybody who worked in any capacity for Public Enemy and anybody who was close to him. He thought it was an amazing book, which I'm grateful to Chuck for. Chuck later reached out to somebody in Toronto who he knew and knew me and asked if this person could put Chuck and me together, which he did. We had an amazing first night together, and many, many times since then we spent time together. So, you know, Chuck used to tell me he would have my box sets, the 2.9 CD and the 110 CD box sets. He would have them on the console in his studio. But the booklets where I wrote the liner notes, he had in plastic separately because he didn't want people to mess them up or lose them. But he had the CDs there for sampling. They sampled tons of Stax stuff, but of course they weren't the only one. Lots of people sampled big hits from Stax and obscure songs. On Vogue and Salt and Pepper sampled "What a Man" by Linda Lindell. Most people don't have a clue who Linda Lindell is. She made 2 singles of Stax, neither of which sold, neither of which got radio play. But because of the box sets, people heard them and sampled them. Ended up being a nice big paycheck for Linda, who was living in a trailer park at that time, broke in an abusive relationship. So it was great to be able to get her that money. But it's also obviously millions of people heard that record. Hip hop was so phenomenal, period. Hip hop introduced millions of people, black, white in North America, but also around the world, to all sorts of parts of Black American history. The sampling in hip hop created knowledge and audiences for Black artists who had lost those audiences because they were no longer current, if you will. I saw James Brown. This was disgusting. Playing on a bill with the Police, the sort of rock pop band, where audience members at a stadium, audience members threw food at him. They didn't know who he was. They had no respect for him. I was disgusted. James Brown is one of the gods of American music. He is so important. Well, hip hop corrected that problem. James Brown and George Clinton and Funkadelic became massively revered, especially in the early years of hip hop. Both of them were probably the 2 most sampled artists. But Stax was sampled massively as well and created income flow, but created an awareness of Black music history and helped certain artists restart, if you will, their careers and get some of the flowers while they were alive. You mentioned that at the very beginning of your show. One of your ideas of doing a show like this is to give flowers to people while they're alive. Hip hop did that. I am so grateful for, DJ Kool Herc for deciding to mix and match those records in August, what was it, 73, and start something that people like Africa Mabata took forward. And as you know the history, it eventually exploded 6 years later. We finally get the first hip hop records in October 79. It changed everything for Black music history, as well as created this phenomenal new music. Now in Memphis was late to the hip hop party in terms of having big records. But when I lived in Memphis, which was 83 to 86, there were hip hop kids. There were kids breakdancing, there were kids rapping. They just weren't breaking internationally or nationally yet. But after I left Memphis, as you know, all the people you talked about popped off. One of the members of 3 6 Mafia recently wrote a book, and he was talking about it in interviews, and he actually kindly referred to me by name and said, Soulsville, USA, The Story of Stax Records, the book that I wrote, made him understand Memphis Black music history and made him think that this was possible, that a Black kid from Memphis could participate in this newer form of Black music and maybe make a living. And of course, they did extraordinarily well and challenged very much the dominance, along with artists from Atlanta, New Orleans, and Houston, challenged the dominance of New York and LA, which for the first many years of hip hop just ruled completely.
Mm-hmm. And I was curious if how much of an influence did you think, personally, your opinion, Stax had on Prince? Because we all know Prince was a mixture
Oh,
of everything. How much do you think Stax influenced his work?
you kidding me? Prince adored Stax. When he started his label, who were the artists he signed? Mavis Staples of the Staples Singers, one of the greatest Stax artists ever. And he used to perform live When Will We Get Paid, which is a great Stax song. It's kind of obscure for most people. It wasn't a hit. It wasn't even released as a single. But he performed that constantly. And you know, Prince, of course, at any given time in his life, in his shows, he would do all sorts of covers, often one-offs, or play something once this year, twice the next year. And he performed tons of Stax covers. He adored that music. I met Prince. I wrote his stuff when he was inducted in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, and I'd given him my book. Stax was incredibly important to him, but he was a polyglot. Prince heard everything. He adored Funkadelic. That's why George Clinton did the Cinderella theory on Prince's label Paisley Park. He also adored Joni Mitchell and always often perform Joni songs live. He had wide ears. He loved Miles Davis. Prince was a polyglot, one of the greatest artists, I think, in history, period. Seriously, I think he's so far up on the food chain of great artists. And it's partially because his an incredible ear and his ears were wide open. Everything influenced him, but Stax was a huge core influence.
Definitely. And I was curious to know your opinion. What if this crossover would have happened where Stax artists would go record at Motown and vice versa? Do you think it would have worked or not have worked because the styles of those two labels were totally different and wouldn't suit the artist for the label?
An interesting question, and one I've never been asked, and I've done a billion interviews. And of course, nobody's got a crystal ball and can say what would have happened. My guess is it's going to one of two things. Artists from Stax who went to Motown and vice versa would have got frustrated because it's not the sound that they were used to, that they loved and brought them success. That said, you could have gone a different way. I mean, the Temptations got very funky, as we all know, late in the 60s and early 70s. They might have thrived with Booker T and the MGs. And Carla Thomas might have been great at Motown. You know, there were two artists who recorded for both labels. Mabel John was the first woman signed to Motown in the very earliest years. I think did 5 singles on Motown. And none of them did much business. Most people didn't hear them. But they're good records. They're not great records. She signed with Stax later on in the 60s and did 7 singles, I believe. And they were great. And she had one really big hit. So her style didn't really suit Berry Gordy's idea of how music should sound. It did fit what could go on at Stax. The other artist who recorded both labels, virtually no one would guess because he doesn't fit either sound. That's Billy Eckstine, the great jazz vocalist. He actually recorded at both Motown and Stax.
Right. And Billy Eckstine, father of famous record man Ed Eckstine.
Absolutely. And Billy Eckstine had this golden baritone voice. He was massive, uh, singing in front of big bands in late 40s and throughout the 50s. He recorded 4 great albums for the Stax subsidiary enterprise and was one of Al Bell's favorite artists to sign with Stax.
Right. And I looked up Soul Decision. They were actually from Canada. They were out of Vancouver.
Oh, my mistake. The other part of the country, but cool.
Out of
Yes.
Vancouver. Now, I would be remiss if we didn't talk about the importance, the legacy, and influence of Isaac Hayes. Was a songwriter for Stax, along with Dave Porter, wrote a lot of big hits for Stax. And then, of course, when he went on his own, recorded his own stuff, and of course, legendary Hot Butter Soul and Shaft won the Oscar, and of course, the records being sampled in hip hop, and then became internationally known outside of his music when he was the voice of Chef on South Park. So can we just talk about the importance, the legacy, and influence of Isaac Hayes?
Isaac Hayes was beyond important. Isaac Hayes changed the political economy of Black music and the possibilities for Black artists. I'll back up and then I'll get to that point. When Isaac came to Stax, he actually was the keyboard player for Floyd Newman, who was one of the Stax horn players for a while. Floyd Newman recorded a single called Frog Stomp. Didn't do anything. It's a great record, but didn't hit. Isaac just played a session. That's it. He was just part of Floyd Newman's band. But Jim Stewart, white country fiddler who co-owned Stax, liked Isaac and saw what he could do. So when Booker T. Jones and Booker T. and the MGs went off to university, Indiana University, they needed a keyboard player for when Booker was away. Isaac became one of the house musicians at Stax. That's how he starts. And Booker would come back on the weekends and in the summer, but in the weekdays, Isaac's a keyboard player, played on lots of great, great, great records. Isaac also had ideas all over the place. Knock on Wood, The Bridge, Isaac creates that as a session player playing on that record. And when Booker does come back permanently, now they have 2 keyboard players, so they start using piano and organ on a lot of records. Isaac would play the organ, Booker the piano. Isaac, multi-talented, could also write songs. At that time, that Stax, also true at Motown, most people wrote songs with a partner. Not that many people wrote songs by themselves. And so Isaac pairs up with David Porter, who'd had a little success, had co-written a Barbara Stevens record way back in '61, but hadn't been able to get many records cut. Had also cut a single solo for Savoy's Little David, hadn't gone anywhere. David's hanging out at Stax trying to get a foot in the door, and he and Isaac partner. And Sam and Dave at that very moment are sent to Stax by Atlantic. They were never signed to Stax, even though all the great records were recorded at Stax and came out on Stax. This was a unique arrangement where they were assigned to Atlantic Records and Atlantic distributed Stax. So Atlantic made a deal where Sam and Dave would record at Stax and Stax would get paid as if they were Stax artists. So Atlantic would get less. And it worked beautifully. Soul Man, Hold On, I'm Coming, I Thank You, Wrap It Up, When Something Goes Wrong With My Baby, every single one of those records, written by Isaac Hayes and David Porter. They came together because both of them needed a partner, and they came to write for Sam and Dave because here's the new kids, if you will. They weren't kids, they're adults, but the new artists at Stax, and no one was too excited about them. Sam and Dave had done 8 singles when they were in Miami, none of which had been hits. Partially because they weren't great songs. They weren't songwriters. Other people wrote those songs and produced them, Steve Alamo being one of the main ones. But Hayes and Porter were great songwriters and were great producers and created masterpieces with Sam and Dave. And they also wrote for other artists. Obviously, once they're hitting with Sam and Dave, they write B.A.B.Y. Baby for Carla Thomas. They write a lot of Johnny Taylor's early records. They write singles for people that most people have never heard of, like Ruby Johnson, but it was some of the deepest soul records ever. They're incredible records, even though they weren't hits. Hayes and Porter, along with Otis Redding and Steve Cropper, and along with Booker T. Jones, who co-wrote with both William Bell and Eddie Floyd, that became the main songwriting teams at Stax. And Hayes and Porter had the most success of them all. Complicated story, but Stax lost their whole back catalog in May '68 because of a bad contract they'd signed with Atlantic. So the label needed to be rebuilt from the ground up. Al Bell, who now had become co-owner with Jim Stewart, came up with a pretty audacious idea. He thought, okay, we don't have a back catalog, let's create instantly one. He mounted a campaign to put 27 albums, it was going to be 28, but Rufus Thomas's was never finished, 27 albums and 30 singles released at once. No company did that. Big companies like RCA, Columbia, MCA, they could never promote that number of records at once. They wouldn't do that. The fact that a small independent label out of Memphis, Tennessee would do that was astonishing. Jerry Wexler, who co-owned Atlantic, told me that's just record business foolishness by people who don't know what they're doing. But Wexler can think what he wants, and it ended up working out brilliantly. But to get that number of albums done, they had every major artist get a solo album, but they also allowed some vanity records to be recorded. By vanity, I mean, let an artist do what they want. We don't expect this to sell much, but it'll be part of our catalog, and maybe over time, we'll, at least break even. So Steve Cropper, the guitarist with Booker T and the MGs, does his first solo album with a little help from my friends. There's a guitar album with Albert King, Pop Staples, and Steve Cropper that is part of this. There's another double album called Boy Meets Girl, where it's all the Stax male vocalists and all the Stax female vocalists doing different duets. It was like, what can we do to create more records? And Isaac Hayes was given the chance to do what he wanted. Complete freedom. Isaac was so important as a writer and producer. Nobody had expectations as a solo artist he'd sell. If you think about his voice, he didn't have that gospel harshness that Sam Moore, Sam and Dave, or Otis Redding had, or Wilson Pickett. He had a crooning baritone that people like Barry White later copy and have massive success with. So Isaac's voice isn't ready-made for what they thought of as a soul market. The other thing is, Isaac, despite being the incredible songwriter he was, loved white pop music. That album, Hot Buttered Soul, has 4 songs on it. An 18-minute version of By the Time I Get to Phoenix that Glenn Campbell, white country pop artist that had hit with, and Jimmy Webb had written. A 12-minute version of Walk On By that 2 white people, Burt Bacharach and Hal David, had written, but Dionne Warwick, a black artist, had had a pop hit with. A song Isaac wrote that was 9 minutes long called Hyperbolic Biscuits, So Sweet I Missed It. And a 4-minute song written by 3 white writers, Charles Chambers and Sandra and Donna Rhodes. This is kind of interesting. Isaac was not going to be limited into a box that black artists were told they belonged in. He wanted to stretch out and do different things. So, first of all, think of the length of those songs, 18, 12, and 9 minutes and 4 minutes. Unprecedented for a black album. Not even that many white rock albums did it, but white rock albums had started doing very extended songs. Obviously, jazz albums had that kind of thing. And Hot Buttered Soul's got massive jazz influence. And it was actually broken on a jazz radio station. And Stax never expected it to break. It wasn't broken pop or R&B. It was a jazz station that broke it in Detroit. One DJ. Anyway, then Isaac put strings on it. Interesting enough, the 2 string arrangers both came out of Detroit. Johnny Allen and Dale Warren, 2 black string arrangers out of the Motown school. And they created these massive, classically influenced string arrangements. So now we got this black R&B artist recording pop songs, but rearranging them dramatically, transforming them with huge jazz influence. massive classical influence, and the lead guitarist is Harold Bean, who would become part of Funkadelic. So another influence coming in, rock and funk with Harold Bean. This is such a fascinating amalgam of so many different styles of music. And Isaac's voice, despite not being a stereotypical soul singer, was unbelievably soulful. Isaac is an incredible singer, radiates soul, but a different type of soul than most record companies thought a Black audience wanted. So this album comes out. Nothing. It's part of 27 albums. They don't expect much. DJ in Detroit starts playing the 9 and 12-minute cuts. Starts getting big traction in Detroit. That's where Isaac played his first gig, by the way, as a solo artist, because of that. And then Stax quickly realizes something's going on here. And they put out edited single-length 3.5-minute versions of By the Time I Get to Phoenix and Walk On By. And it starts going R&B and pop. That album, Hot Butter Soul, goes into the #1 position, pop, R&B, jazz, and easy listening. Tell me how many records can hit the top of 4 different charts, 4 different or arguably different demographics. He became huge along with James Brown and Aretha Franklin. He's the most important artist in the first half of the 70s in Black music. And he becomes known as Black Moses. He breaks a barrier in terms of scoring films by Black composers with Shaft. Yes, Melvin Van Peebles had done his own film, Sweetback's Badass Song, which came out on Stax, by the way. Melvin wasn't a Stax artist, but was signed to Stax because of that soundtrack. But that doesn't really break the film, significant film, important film in Black music, Black movie history. But the record doesn't break. Earth, Wind, and Fire actually did a house band on that, interestingly. It's Shaft by Isaac in 1971 that blows up in the so-called genre. Lots of people don't like the name. I'm not fond of it. Blaxploitation genre. And Shaft goes platinum. Shaft wins a Grammy and it wins an Academy Award. First Black composer to ever win an Academy Award. And Isaac's performance that year in the Academy Awards was beyond brilliant. It was incredible. Isaac becomes embraced literally with that phrase, Black Moses, coined by a DJ in Philadelphia, I believe, when introducing him one night. But it catches on. The Black press refers to him as Black Moses. Stax eventually puts out a double album called Black Moses, which for anybody who's never heard of it, it's one of the greatest records you'll ever hear. But the important thing ultimately was Hot Butter Soul sold so much, hit those 4 charts as I talked about, that it made people at other record companies wake up. Jerry Wexler, co-owner of Atlantic, who put out great Black music by Percy Sledge, Wilson Pickett, Solomon Burke, Aretha Franklin, Ray Charles, and so on, he told me that if you sold 30,000 copies of a Black record in the 1960s, you had saturated the market. Industry wisdom was Black people didn't have the money and weren't inclined to buy full-length albums. They bought singles. So that's what you concentrated on. And bigger artists like James Brown and Otis Redding could put out an album, and over time it might sell 250,000 copies, which isn't insignificant, but it's far away from the million Isaac sold. But James and Otis were the exceptions. Most Black artists, if you sold 30,000 copies, according to industry wisdom, that was it. Isaac Hayes proved that was so wrong. Give Black artists the money and the studio time to do what they wanted to do. And of course, they could make records like the Beatles or Bob Dylan or anybody else who was selling millions of records. Isaac proved that. And that led to Stevie Wonder and Marvin Gaye getting a chance to do these extraordinary records that they did. Following that, Curtis Mayfield becomes an album artist after that. Funkadelic takes a while for them to blow up, but they start recording these very complex and often conceptual records. All of that happens because Isaac Hayes breaks things wide open with Hot Butter Soul and Stacks. It's
Yeah,
an extraordinary record.
yeah, and it's crazy how you mentioned, that was the start of record label saying Black folks buy albums, not just singles, and also at the same time you had Watt Stats going on, and then this little program that became the hippest trip in America, Soul Train. All of
Yes,
that was merging at the same time, and also we had Soul that was on PBS, hosted by Ellis Hayslip, and how it was the first time record labels and people were paying attention, saying let's cater exclusively to the Black demographic. And then, of course, in 1980, we have the launch here in the States of BET.
absolutely. Ellis Hayslip's show out in New York called Soul. A lot of people haven't known about this. Fortunately, his niece made a wonderful film about it. That's I don't know where it's available on streaming sources, but it's played some theaters, maybe up on the internet somewhere. But if you can, you need to watch it. Ellis Hayslip was important, and that show was incredible because yes, he allowed people like Al Green on it, great, but he also had people like Gil Scott Heron on it. He had members of the Black Panthers. He had Dick Gregory. This show was a great musical show, but it also addressed issues that most the Black community that most television at the time would never touch. And of course, Soul Train was what American Bandstand had been, but for Black folk. And of course, anybody white could watch it too, and lots did. But every week you saw incredible Black artists on Soul Train and covering the gamut soul, funk, later disco, it all got on there. And BET was a game changer too. Came on, I think when I was living in Memphis, I remember, that's where I first got to see it. And in the early days of BET, obviously played a lot of Black videos that MTV was not playing, but they also programmed great historical stuff. They had these clips they found from the Apollo Theater in the 1940s and 50s, and maybe even into the early 60s. And they would, at various times, play 20 minutes or 30 minutes of these clips where you would see incredible people you'd never seen video of. Uh, I used to, back then, of course, we had video recorders. I'd set up my video recorder to record that stuff in BET, whether I was awake or home or not, because this was stuff I wanted to see. It was great.
Yeah, because I'm sure those imports of Soul Train was selling like hotcakes when they made it internationally, especially in Japan, where they had the bootlegs with the subtitles at the bottom. And I want to go back to when you mentioned Sam and Dave, how they were signed to Atlantic, but they recorded their stuff at Stax. It's almost kind of like the same thing with Run DMC, because when you think of Run DMC, you think of them as Def Jam. They weren't signed to Def Jam, they were signed to Profile. So almost those two situations are similar to each other, where you associate the artist with this particular label, but they were never signed directly to the other.
Absolutely. And Run DMC, as anybody knows their hip hop history, will know, middle class kids out of Queens. And the sound that they brought to hip hop was so radically new at the time. They were a game changing group. I remember going to see Funkadelic, George Clinton Parliament Funkadelic in Memphis, and Run DMC was the opening group. And they were so incredibly powerful and so different than the hip hop I'd been hearing from Spoonie G or Schoolie D or, a Sequence, let alone, of course, Sugar Hill Gang and Grandmaster Flash. Run DMC created a very different world. It was very cool.
Yeah, and with Parliament, my introduction to them was hearing it through De La Soul, with them sampling Not Just Knee Deep for Me, Myself, and I off of the classic album 3 Feet High and Rising. And that introduced Parliament to a whole new generation. Also, backdoor through NBA Jam, because George Clinton was an unlockable character on NBA Jam. DIS start B button for Sega. If you know, you know.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And that kind of goes back to what I said earlier about how wonderful hip hop was. Not just because there were great, great, great records made, but because it turned on new generations to Black music history. You're a perfect example. That's the way you found about Parliament. I knew about Funkadelic when Testify came out. Well, they're part of the Parliaments then, but then Funkadelic put out their first album with Maggot Brain on it. Because I'm older than you, and I grew up in that period. But people like you got the joy of discovering them because younger artists making brilliant records like 3 Foot High and Rising, what a great record that was, turned you on to stuff. And later, of course, Dr. Dre, the whole G-Funk thing, really turned a lot of people onto Parliament Funkadelic.
Yeah, because when I heard that Hyperbolic Isaac Hayes record and that piano I was like, oh, that's where Public Enemy got that from. And when I heard I'm like, oh, that's where Ghetto Boys got my mind playing tricks on me from. And I'm like, oh, I've heard these records, but now I can put where the original source material came from because of the secondary introduction through these hip hop records.
So you're locked into history, but you also have the pleasure of hearing these other sounds that are extraordinary unto themselves. You can hear De La Soul and you can hear Isaac Hayes. And there's a relationship which you got, but they're also quite different, and they're both wonderful in different ways. I mean, I think it's just so important the way what hip hop did for earlier forms of Black music.
Yeah, it definitely did wonders. Now, why do you think some of those older artists were slow to embrace it? Was because, of course, it's a young genre. They didn't understand it. And this was before samples were getting cleared. So it was where let's hope to sample this record before somebody comes knock and say, where's my money?
Yeah, it was the Wild West in terms of sampling. And there were not a lot of codified um, understandings of how much should be paid for what kind of use, blah, blah, blah. And you get these incredible records. If you listen to Public Enemy's early records, nobody could make them now. There's so many samples, you couldn't afford to clear them all because it's been established you need to pay or you will be sued. But in those earlier days, it's funny. You listen to Rapper's Delight, which was, one of the first two hip hop records. Is arguing between that and Fat Bat Band, between King Tim the Third, Personality Jock. But they both came out in the first week of October '79. A lot of people think they sampled Chic's Good Times, which was a massive hit in June '79, 4 months earlier, 5 months earlier. They actually didn't. If you listen closely, it's session musicians. And why? Because in the park jams and people spinning records at the Hevalo Club in the Bronx, let alone at private parties like where Cool Herc started everything, people spun records and people rapped over those records. But the idea of rapping over records in a studio seems so bizarre that most of the early hip hop records, the very first ones, are not sampled. Session musicians are doing their best to copy things. Grandmaster Flash and the Wheels of Steel is where I think it's 11 different records he sampled and mixed, cut and chopped in all sorts of great ways. And of course, introduced scratching. I mean, people have been scratching in the park jams before. Grand Wizard Theater is supposedly the person who first started it, although, it's not on record. But that starts people thinking, oh, we can use records. I mean, we can't use earlier records to record new records. We don't have to try to get session musicians to replicate it, and we can mess with them in interesting ways. You listen to, where's my brain? Public Enemy's huge hit, the first huge hit.
Yo, Bum Rush the Show.
Fight the Power. No, I'm thinking Fight the Power. If you listen to it closely, at one point in the chorus, you hear, it's part of the word I, a one-syllable word that's been chopped in half, if not in a third. And it's from Bob Marley's backup singers, the I3 singing I Shot the Sheriff. And it's a micro sample. Most people aren't going to hear that, although Chuck D's talked about it. So once you know about it, you can easily hear it. That kind of thing people can't do now because they're going to pay for that little micro thing. Things cost too much. But back then, nobody even knew it, so you didn't have to clear it. And sampling was used in such innovative ways. Lots of the older musicians, you're right, were not happy at first. Two reasons. You said them both. They didn't understand it. The idea of people talking and using pre-existing records to make music, that is beyond radical. People now probably can't see that. They've grown up with hip hop just being part of the world and a dominant part of the world. But when I first saw two turntables and a microphone, I was mind blown. It was avant-garde. People think of pop music as being, and things like hip hop as somehow being simple. They come out of communities that are not as educated, they're not musically schooled. That's ridiculous. Hip hop was such a radical avant-garde move. You know, it changed the whole idea of what music could be. This is great, great art. But yes, people didn't understand it. White people, older Black people, lots of people didn't get it at first. And they thought, I remember reading a quote from the great jazz guitarist L. Di Meola going, where are the people who spent years learning to play their instruments? He was saying hip hop wasn't music. Well, of course, he was invested in spending years learning to play the guitar and going to a moneyed school like Berkeley School of Music, learning music theory inside out for what he does as a jazz guitarist. Fine. But I think he couldn't understand and resented these kids who had never gone to music school. Some of them, took up turntablism and within a couple of years were great. And by the way, I always said to people in those early days who would criticize hip hop, show me what you can do on two turntables, because it is an art, just as playing the cello is, or playing the guitar or the piano. It is, and it's an art that developed over time, of course. People got better as the bar was this high, then the bar became this high, and so on. But in the early days, people like James Brown were super critical because of your second reason, too. They saw their music as being stolen. They weren't doing very well financially. They were making a tenth of what they once made playing gigs because they're no longer making currently popular music. Some of them were even doing worse than that. Their records weren't selling, so they weren't getting royalties. And they just thought they were being ripped off. Of course, eventually people figured out you got a copyright on it, you can sue people, get paid. Now, those chunks of change were nice. And of course, what probably nobody really thought through initially was not only could you get paid for the sample, but this music's being introduced to a whole new world. James Brown and George Clinton Parliament Funkadelic started selling a lot more records than they'd ever sold before, and they're playing bigger venues with younger kids because the sampling in hip hop rescued their careers. They ended up doing very well by hip hop. But in the earliest days, when people weren't paying for samples, nothing had been worked out legally in terms of what do you pay for that fraction of I, as opposed to a 2-bar loop of somebody's groove out of Funky Drummer, for example, that's used all over the place. What should be paid? Then you get issues like for Funky Drummer, James Brown single. Does Clyde Stubblefield or Jabal Starks, James's two drummers, get paid? Or does James? And of course, it was James because he's the artist. Clyde and Jabbo got paid for playing the session. That's it. They never got royalties. So they didn't benefit from the samples. So if you go down the food chain, a lot of session musicians who remained upset because lines they had created, grooves they had created are being used, but the artist named on the record is getting the paycheck, not them, from the hip hop sample.
Because I remember a speech from Arrested Development told a story about how when Prince found out that they sampled Alphabet Street for Tennessee, which became a crossover smash for Arrested Development, and when Prince found out, Prince was like, hey, pay me this flat fee. I won't ask you to yank it. And they ended up paying the fee. It became a big hit, but On the other hand, Biz Markie, rest in peace, had sampled Gilbert O'Sullivan's Alone Again Naturally off the album I Need a Haircut. And Gilbert
Right.
O'Sullivan was like, you gonna pay me or yank the record off. And I Need a Haircut ended up getting yanked off store shelves.
My understanding is a little different. Gilbert O'Sullivan wouldn't do it for any money. He disliked hip hop and thought what Biz Markie was doing wasn't something he wanted his music to be part of. But another interesting part of that story is Biz Markie was only sampling the piano intro. Gilbert didn't write that piano intro or play it. The session pianist did. And that session player came out and said, I don't mind it sampled. So it's kind of interesting. What the part Biz Markie wants to sample, the musician who created it and played it was cool with it. But because Biz Markie owned the record and that session musician had been paid a flat session fee and did not make royalties, Gilbert could stop it. And again, it was stopped because he didn't like what Biz Markie and that music represented. Malico Records out of Jackson, Tennessee. It's got the biggest gospel catalog now in the world because they bought up Savoy, Apollo, Atlanta International. It's incredible what they own. Plus, of course, they've had their own 50-year history of recording great gospel music. You know, they cornered the mass choir movement and they revived tons of quartets in terms of popularity. Well, they have Reverend James Cleveland, by buying Savoy. And they make a lot of money sampling and are happy to sample. But when somebody wants to sample any of their religious records, they listen to the lyrics and they decide, would this be something Reverend James Cleveland and his audience be comfortable with using his music on this song? So you can imagine if the lyrics address drugs, sex, criminal activity, they're going to say no. If the lyrics address other things, they'll say yes. So Gilbert O'Sullivan became a big name because he refused to let his music be sampled. But he hasn't been the only one. But Gilbert never gave a good reason. I can understand why Malico might feel protective about a gospel artist having his music used in a very secular context that he might not have agreed to.
Mhm.
But Gilbert Sullivan, I don't know if he's just flat racist or just couldn't stand what hip hop was as a music, but
Right, yeah, because Prince was one of those artists that rarely let his stuff get cleared. So it was surprising when Pray by MC Hammer came out. It sampled When Doves Cry, and I guess Hammer played it for Prince, and Prince gave it the stamp of approval.
and George Clinton began to realize just, hey, how much money there was out in that field and started putting out, if you remember, CDs of just samples, drum grooves, drum and bass grooves. These weren't songs. These were just stuff he had from sessions, jamming with members of Parliament and Funkadelic that he thought, these might be good for sampling. Let me put them out and see if DJs pick up on them. More paychecks. People began to realize sampling was a very important source of revenue, let alone popularity for your gigs and your own records, but revenue for clearing the samples.
Right. And I want to talk about real quick before we close about the new game changer in the music industry, of course, streaming, and how a lot of the older labels, when writing these contracts, then factor in future mediums that would come about and how the money's going to get split for the streams because we're seeing artists boycotting various platforms because of the low pay rates. And then with the signing of the bad deals in their masters, that's why we're seeing Taylor Swift and other artists doing a re-record of a lot of their original albums so they can maintain ownership. So a lot of them, because of the internet, are getting wise to I gotta know the business and be about it. When Michael Jackson, Prince was pretty much telling everybody all along, own your stuff, own your stuff. Because when you look at those record label contracts, they were just like the mafia out of Vegas, where it's set up for the house to win and for you to lose. And you're going to trade in your royalties and your songwriting and publishing rates for either a paper bag full of money or a Cadillac.
You got to It's own your own masters or your masters own you. And people didn't understand that for decades. And, artists who came, out of a background where they certainly weren't going to university or business school were easy prey. And this goes back 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s. It just keeps going on. And it happens to white and black artists who don't know better. Some people figured it out early. Dave Clark of the Dave Clark Five, this is crazy. He was a contemporary of the Beatles. He wouldn't sign a deal unless he got his masters back 3 years after they were released. They became very rich because of that. The Beatles had no idea. Either did their manager Brian Epstein, either did James Brown. They signed all of them early contracts with bad royalty rates, and they don't own their masters. It took a long time for people to understand, and young kids, white or black, again, making any music, they want to be stars. They want people to hear their music. They see stars who have beautiful cars, beautiful homes, live beautiful lives. They would like that. And if they don't have a record company contract, a lot of people feel they're never going to get that. The internet's made it possible sometimes to get that without signing with big labels, obviously. But even when you sign with independents, they're getting distributed often by big labels, and it's still a rip-off system. And a lot of independents are happy to rip artists off just as much as the majors. So a lot of people under pressure sign that first contract without getting proper legal advice, or they don't even know who's a good lawyer to go to. They just go to a family friend who's in the music entertainment business, and it goes, oh yeah, this is okay. And it's not. And streaming, of course, has now complicated it even more. But Taylor Swift wasn't the first to re-record her music to gain some control. Lots of artists, even from the 50s, when they were no longer popular, they had left their record label, but the record label was putting out greatest hits records. A lot of artists re-recorded their greatest hits and put out their own greatest hits records on different labels. They weren't the original records, but they were hoping that some of their audience would buy it, not knowing there was a difference. Difference now is Taylor's, of course, very public about this is Taylor's version, as opposed to the one that she feels was stolen away from her by the sale of her catalog. And streaming's a separate but related issue. In fact, Taylor kept her music off Spotify a long time. Streaming, unfortunately, has become the majority of ways that people consume music. And no artist is powerful to stop it, unfortunately. Some artists hate it because it's often just MP3 quality. You don't hear the music in the way that they made it, and they'd like you to hear it. But of course, many, many, many hundreds of thousands have been very upset by the royalty rates streaming organizations pay. And this is complicated because Spotify, the most major streaming house, they pay 70% of what they make in royalties. The problem is they don't make enough for that 70% to get paid to labels who then offer crumbs to artists for it to work well for individual artists unless they're in the top tier, the very top tier. Very top tier get paid very well. And some people slightly below that could make good middle class incomes. But the majority of artists, 65,000 songs are uploaded to Spotify a day. How many of those ever get played by anyone, let alone by a million people?
Mm-hmm.
There's way too much music.
Yeah.
It's a glut, and it can't be paid for if you're allowing people to stream for $12 a month.
Yeah, you definitely can't put the tube back on the toothpaste. Now, you mentioned top tier. Now, back to Stax and the songwriting. You mentioned, Hayes and Porter. Did most of those labels kind of a system where your top tier stars get the top shelf high quality songs and the other artists who were mid tier and lower got the scraps, or was it where, hey, we're just gonna workshop the song, try it on different artists, and if it fits you, you'll take it?
Well, in streaming, it works differently. The labels don't determine, I mean, they do determine what they ultimately give an artist, but they don't determine what Spotify gives them. Actual streams do determine what artists get a lot more money. And so the labels gets a chunk of cash this size for one artist and this size for another. Obviously, the artist with the bigger chunk of cash, his or her percentage is going to be more dollars than the other artist. The labels don't determine how much streaming goes on. That said, just as labels have always paid payola to radio stations to get played, they manipulate Spotify playlists. They got people that their whole job is to get their artists on playlists that many people sample and hopefully get turned on to their artists. And just like radio, they can't force people to buy something, but people won't buy something if they don't know it exists. So with 65,000 songs being uploaded every damn day, you need somehow to be heard. And paying to manipulate playlists is one way of getting an artist heard and giving that artist a chance, if they resonate with the public, to get more streams. One of the interesting things about all this too, you get a song in a movie or in a television show that's a big hit, your streams go crazy. So people get these out of the blue, streaming hits, but it's random and most people don't get it. But that wouldn't happen as much on radio the way it happens with streaming. And artists, of course, lots of them still put out vinyl and CDs in limited amounts. And, they sell them at gigs or Amazon sells them. And although vinyl's been going up in sales for years, it's still a very small fraction of the overall business. Streaming is the action. Back in the 20s, 30s, 40s, and even 50s and early 60s, a lot of artists saw records as advertisements for their live gigs. In other words, they didn't think their money was in recordings. They thought the recordings on the radio would make people aware of them and allow them to play more gigs for more people for more money. And it changed. The record industry went crazy in terms of sales, 60s, 70s, with MTV even further in the 80s, when, of course, the CD came out in the 80s, which made people rebuy music they already owned. It was an amazing period in terms of glut of money happening in the music industry. But once Napster came around and people could get it for free, then eventually Spotify developed a way that people were willing to pay because it wasn't that much money and they had virtually unlimited access to unlimited amounts of music. The record industry came on board and major labels partially own Spotify. You probably know that. But the problem is, for Spotify to work, you can't have things like Napster where people can get it for free. But if you raise the price too high on Spotify, there will be free stuff on the market. There actually still is if you go deep enough, but most people can't be bothered to download from hard to find illegal sites that might have viruses. They'll pay the $12 to Spotify, but there's not enough $12 to add up so that middle and lower tier artists can do as well as they may have once done. That's part of the problem.
Yeah, it's still the same game as it was in the analog era, and now in the digital stream era, you still got to pay to play.
Yeah, and artists, unfortunately, again, unless they're top tier, are going to make less from pay to play. But there is actually more mid-level artists who can make a middle class living, not becoming rich, not become super famous, but build a fan base, often through all the social media activities of the artist, and stream enough so they can continually gig and make some money. Again, not fortunes, but make enough that's as good as if you were a plumber, lower level employee at a bank, or places where you can make a living, but you're not getting rich. But you're making music. You're not doing something you don't want to do.
Yeah,
So
definitely. So it
it's
almost,
it's
oh, sorry, didn't mean to cut you off.
that's okay.
I was just gonna say it kind of reminds me of the Southern Soul circuit. I'm from North Carolina, and a
Yeah,
lot of these Southern Soul acts, they will go tour around the Carolinas, Virginia, Georgia, Texas, Mississippi, Alabama, and make a good living just touring those regions of the country. Almost the same situation as you're making good money selling your albums independently before major labels come knocking. But back before the internet, you had to get distributed to a major if you wanted to be heard nationally, or did you want to just be confined to just being a regional success?
you're right. That Southern circuit, um, and it hit Tennessee as well. I used to see a lot of those artists when I lived in Memphis. And those artists rarely played in the North. But the other thing that for those artists, especially the soul blues artists like Bobby Blue Bland, Denise LaSalle, Lattimore, later day Johnny Taylor, Little Milton, for a lot of those artists, there were these small stations throughout the South that was their format. They played soul blues through the 80s and 90s when soul music was no longer a nationally popular music that crossed over, but had a hardcore, largely Black, but not exclusively, audience that would come see them every time they came yearly to Memphis or, to Jackson, Mississippi or Birmingham, wherever. Those radio stations played their music. When the FCC deregulated radio and Clear Channel bought up hundreds of stations across the US that became centrally programmed. It killed the exposure outlet for those labels. And then when streaming came, it meant all the little mom and pop record stores that sold to older Black consumers who loved that music still and would buy the CDs, they closed because people weren't buying CDs anymore. They were getting things for free, and then they were paying Spotify. So the infrastructure got killed by the deregulation of radio and the advent of streaming. So some of those artists still, like Mr. Sip, can play that circuit. But there's fewer of them that can do it, and shows are fewer and far between than they once were.
Yeah, definitely with that Southern Soul, definitely a national treasure. Like I said, I grew up on it, been from North Carolina, and that's all I heard growing up at cookouts. And of course, that down home blues commercial was a staple on BT back in the late 80s, early 90s, because I remember seeing that
Sure.
commercial heavily as a kid growing up. So before we conclude, any shout outs you want to give and also plug any current projects that you're working on and social media if you're on socials.
Okay. What I'll plug is my book, Soulsville, USA, The Story of Stax Records, but that ties into the 4-hour, 4-part documentary on HBO and Max, very similarly titled. This one's titled Stax, Soulsville, USA, but they work together perfectly. I have another documentary coming out towards the end of the year on Jackie Shane, a great Black soul singer from the 60s who was only really known in Boston, LA, Toronto, and Montreal, but was great and was a transgendered artist. So that her story, I think, is very, very important in the current days. I'm working on a book on Muscle Shoals. Um, in some ways, it'll be a sister book to the Stax book because so much great Southern soul was recorded in Muscle Shoals. I'd say not as much as Stax, but really important artists, Candy Staden, Bobby Womack, of course, Pickett, Aretha earlier, and a lot of more obscure people, Arthur Alexander, but really great music. So that's my current book project. I've got a couple other things that I'm going to get to, including some films and another book. And last year I did a 12 CD box set on Wattstax, the whole festival, every note. So I just keep plugging away. Oh, and I write part of the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame program every year. I did Alexis Corner for this year's program for the induction in October. So I keep being active and keep trying to work with and document the history of the music and artists that I love and I think should have a greater light shined on them.
Yes, sir. And you can catch this interview wherever you stream podcasting on YouTube for the video at youtube.com/beyond the album cover. Ladies and gentlemen, let's give a big thank you, round of applause to Professor York University out of the T. Toronto, Ontario, Canada, Mr. Rob Bowman. Mr. Bowman, thank you for coming on. You're welcome back anytime.
Thank you, Gerald, for inviting me, and I happily come back whenever you want.
Yes, sir.
You have a great day.
Yes, sir.